that I'm going to focus much of my comments on what I think is one of the most pressing challenges of education today, and that is educational inequality. I kind of want to apologize in advance for that. It's not the most lighthearted topic, but I will use this as an example of when you have a calling, you share in that calling even when it's a tiny bit uncomfortable. What we know is that in every aspect of education, access to well-trained teachers, high-quality curriculum, adequately resourced buildings, graduation rates, access to technology, and standardized test scores, there are vast differences by race and social class. Gloria Ladson-Billings has referred to this as the education debt, to signal the debt our country owes marginalized groups around the educational opportunities that were denied to them. But before I get any more deeply into the direct conversation about education, I want to open with a couple of personal stories, both of which illustrate a principle I think we can apply to thinking about educational inequality and the importance of not just understanding current inequalities, but contextualizing them within an historical perspective. So the first story is about my family. Sometime around November 2016, I was upset about some recent national events, unable to face the world, when I found the perfect distraction, Ancestry.com. There I was, staring at my family tree on both sides as far back as I could go. Now I'm biracial, so I was able to trace the black side of my family back to the first generation born out of slavery. Right? You can't go back further than that because there aren't birth certificates. And I was able to trace the white side of my family clear back to the Mayflower. So that was a really long setup to tell you this one thing. So when I stepped back and looked at the occupations of my relatives over all of these generations, it had never been so clear to me the costs of segregation and systematic racism in this country. For generations on the black side of my family, there were laundresses and housekeepers and nannies and carpenters and farmhands and general laborers. While on the white side, you see kind of the full range of professions, with reverends and rabbis and artists and doctors and chemists and lawyers and business people, and certainly some farmhands and secretaries and laborers there too, but not for generations and not systematically. And I thought about those black ancestors of mine, no less brilliant of mind and spirit than me, right? I was able to get a PhD, write books, lead this amazing foundation, who took all of that brilliance and potential and went to substandard segregated schools and washed other people's laundry for generations. The second story builds on the first. It's not about family trees. It is about whiskey. Yeah, now you're with me. So last summer, I got a frantic call from a very dear friend, an avid whiskey drinker, who had read a recent story in the New York Times about Jack Daniel's whiskey. And the story had put him in a bind. The Jack Daniel's company was renovating its visitor center, right? And in doing so, they happened upon some previously lost records. So for many years, the visitor center had been telling the story that the secret to Jack Daniel's whiskey was this recipe that Jack created. And kind of, he built this company around this really original recipe for whiskey. But it turns out, this new information that they found showed that the recipe was not Jack's at all. The recipe belonged to a slave that Jack owned. And so not only was the recipe of this slave, the descendants of this original slave worked for the Jack Daniel's company for generations, lending their expertise to this endeavor. And my friend's dilemma was about whether he could still drink the whiskey, knowing that it was built on the backs of slaves who themselves nor their descendants were able to reap any of the benefit of the profits of their labor. And so for me, both of these stories illustrate that racial inequality, along with gender inequality and many other forms of exclusion that are part of our national and global history, obviously existed sometime in the past, like in the way back past. But they also carry forward to the present in tangible and consequential ways. And so in the two stories, the past inequalities that carry into the present have to do with social mobility and finances and the ability to reap the the financial worth of one's labor. But similarly, the current state of inequality in education can't be understood without facing the really hard things about our past with respect to the atrocities to humanity and the denials of opportunity we've committed in our society and in education. I promise you, it's going to get more positive as I go, and stick with me a little while longer. Our national educational past involves not only the undereducation of Black children through Jim Crow laws and the practices of segregation, but also Native American children taken from their families to assimilate them. So there's like a lot, right? And that past, that complicated past carries forward into our present to maintain an unequal playing field, unearned advantage, undeserved disadvantage, and intergenerational trauma for both the marginalized and the privileged, because it takes a lot to hold on to privilege. And if we are to achieve the goal of providing high-quality education to all children and young people, then our task is not to run from the challenges, not to run from the truth, not to run from the depressing parts, but to unearth them and take them up courageously. And so I want to talk about 3 current challenges in education today. I'll do so pretty quickly, with an eye towards what we need to do to be prepared as we go out into the world to improve education as educators and as scholars. The first challenge is divestment in education as a public good. The very nature of how we think and talk about public education has shifted. At its best, a system of public schooling is not just about educating children. It's about creating a well-educated, thoughtful, critically engaged populace, right? Philosophers of education write about public schooling as a key element of our democracy, because it is through the pedagogies, practices, and curricula in school that young people learn how to be citizens. The idea of public schools, the frame we use to understand schooling, has been shifting. Public schools have moved from being considered a public good, existing for the good of society as a whole, to being thought of and discussed as a private good, something families can use to get into college and achieve access to resources and wealth. This is an alarming shift because it means that our decisions about education lose their center, which should be how we improve the whole of society through our system of education, and it becomes about how individuals and families use education and access to retain or gain privilege, and as educators don't have a clear vision for what a transformative system of public education looks like, one that would support us. The second challenge I want to discuss is the resegregation of schools. Gary Orfield has written extensively about resegregation patterns in schools. The short of it is that we all know that formal desegregation in this country happened after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, right? However, less known is that in about 1990, the progress made after Brown started to be reversed. School segregation was made possible by extreme residential segregation in this country, which was created by policies and practices around housing. I think there's a silver lining there, because if segregation was created by laws and policies, it can be uncreated by laws and policies. The third challenge I want to talk about is reductive measures of learning. And the gist of it is this. Since the introduction of No Child Left Behind in the early 1990s, we have been in an era of attempts to measure learning to hold schools and teachers accountable. Great intentions here. George Bush, who apparently was a graduation speaker here a few years back, said that one of the goals of No Child Left Behind was to root out, quote, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And indeed, core to NCLB policies was to compare learning outcomes across subgroups to ensure everyone had equal opportunity. Unfortunately, it was a little like that story about the guy who's looking for his keys under the lamppost, not because that's where he lost them, but because that's where the light is shining, right? We ended up measuring learning not in terms of what we thought was most important to measure, but rather what we could measure easily and economically with standardized tests. The problem here is twofold. First, the measures themselves didn't tell us very much about whether or not schools were providing the rich learning opportunities for learners, whether they were teaching critical thinking skills and higher order problem solving skills. They reduced learning to facts and formulas, and then went so far as to pay teachers based on student test scores, or to sanction whole schools based on the scores of their students. This had many perverse effects that are well documented. Teachers changing practices, teaching to the test, whole schools working to game the system, and the poor performing students being pushed out or being told to stay home on test day. And what we need to figure out is how to measure, reward, and grow the kinds of learning we know intuitively, and by research, is what all kids should have access to. Learning that sets their curiosity on fire. And so, graduates, after you walk across the stage this afternoon, and after you celebrate with your loved ones, which may or may not involve Jack Daniels whiskey, I encourage you to use the full power of your education and your brilliance to build something that matters to education. We learn in our field to critique, right? And critique is really important, but I also challenge you to build something that affirms humanity, that disrupts long-standing inequalities, that develops people, that heals, that creates educational opportunity that is richer, steeped in the richness and beauty of what learning should be. That is our responsibility as the educated and as the open-hearted and as those stewarding the future of our nation. And so I challenge you to stay committed, to find and stay in that space of purpose, to find and cultivate working from a space of possibility, radical possibility, to take up large, complex, perhaps messy, but critically important problems of education and of society, and to see yourself as key to solving those problems, not just observing or documenting them. I challenge you to look at inequalities squarely in the face, to acknowledge their long-standing historical antecedents rooted in hate and dehumanization, and to commit to doing your part to creating structures and opportunities and educational spaces of love that disrupt inequality and create new possibility. Congratulate you and look forward to seeing all the amazing work you will do.